Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to From Creation to Christ, the story of our salvation. Today we're on week 5, the covenant with Moses. First thing, I have to get this out of the way about Moses. Moses supposes his toes are roses, but Moses supposes erroneously. For Moses, he knows his toes aren't roses, as Moses supposes his toes to be. That was mostly for my kids. Little vocal warm-up for us. Anyways, we're going to jump in with the covenant with Moses. Let's go ahead and take just a second to get caught up on where we are in the story from last time. So last time we were talking about Abraham. And we, of course, remember Abraham and his son Isaac. So Isaac goes on to have his own children. He has a son named Jacob who becomes named Israel after he wrestles with an angel. He wrestles with God. And he asks for a blessing, and God gives him the blessing. This is a story of how does he excel in life. You wrestle with God. We all have to wrestle and encounter God in some way. So this is we can suddenly change, right? Instead of me having to try and remember to say the chosen people. With Israel, he's going to have 12 sons, and these are going to be the 12 tribes of Israel. And we can finally start using properly the term Israel for these 12 tribes. But you might remember the story. He has 12 sons. Those 12 sons, you'll remember the story of Joseph, the son that seems to have love more than the others. He's sold into slavery, eventually makes it all the way over to Egypt. This great famine comes, and before the famine, Joseph is a slave, born, sold into slavery, but he starts having these visions of dreams, and Pharaoh takes him into his court because he becomes this interpreter of his dreams, and he eventually raises to this very elevated position, and he interprets through these dreams that there are going to be years of great abundance and then years of famine. And so he's given this court position where he's able to help guide the kingdom of Egypt to store the abundance and prepare for the famine. And just as the famine is happening, people from all over are coming to him asking him for some of the abundance, and his brothers eventually come to him and don't recognize him at first, but ask for some food to take away. And eventually, through this reconnection, he embraces them, even though they weren't so kind to him, but he embraces them, and eventually all 12 of these tribes end up in Egypt. Maybe a great coming together of brothers at first, of tribes, of their followers, but now we have all of these people in Egypt, and a new Pharaoh comes along. And he decides eventually that these are no longer going to be a chosen people, no longer a lofty position in the court, but they fall into slavery. So this is kind of the setup, the setup of the backstory, going from Abraham to getting to where the people are enslaved in Egypt. They're stuck and they're trapped. And Pharaoh decides that he is going to have a bit of a culling of the herd. He thinks that the slaves are getting too many, and his solution, we've seen it in the past, we'll see it again, is they're going to kill the firstborn males. Less of these people, less of these slaves to worry about. And this, I suppose, is where we get Moses. Moses is a firstborn male. He's set to be executed as soon as he can be found. But his mother has a plan. She puts him in a basket in the river and sends him down river in the basket to Pharaoh's daughter. He gets the name Moses, which means drawn out of the water. And now this is, I think, such a humorous part of Scripture. Pharaoh's daughter decides to adopt the baby, but she says, "But this baby's so young." At the time, there's no milk formula to feed the children. They used wet nurses. So she goes looking for a wet nurse, and who does she find to be the wet nurse for the baby she's just adopted? The baby's biological mother, Moses' own mother. But Moses is in a very interesting position. He's from these enslaved people, but he's growing up in Pharaoh's court. And he just has this kind of prized place in Pharaoh's court that obviously none of the other people have. They're all just completely in slavery. They suffer all the violence and the evil of that, and he's in Pharaoh's court. At one moment, he sees a slave master attacking a slave. He thinks he's going to kill him, and Moses intervenes and kills the slave master. And he thinks that this crime is going to catch up with him, so eventually he flees. He leaves Egypt. He flees. He gets married off in the wilderness as a shepherd, and this is where we get one of the first great encounters of Moses. Moses is a firstborn male. He's from these enslaved people, but he's growing up in Pharaoh's court. And he has this kind of prized place in Pharaoh's court that obviously none of the other people have. They're all just completely in slavery. They suffer all the violence and the evil of that, and he's in Pharaoh's court. the encounter with the burning bush. He sees this bush off in the distance that is burning but not being consumed. So it's in flames, but it's just staying on fire. It's not burning down to anything. Very interesting encounter. And as soon as he gets close, God starts talking to him. And God is going to give him a mission to go back in Egypt and free the people. And Moses accepts this task. He listens, and he asks a very important question. He says, who are you? What should I say that your name is when they ask me? And God replies, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you. And they ask, what is his name? The people ask, what is his name? What do I tell them? God replied to Moses. He says, I am who am. God replied to Moses, I am who am. Then he added, this is what you are to tell the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. I am has sent me to you. I think a lot of us are very familiar with this phrase of I am who am, but think about it just for a minute. This is quite bizarre and quite odd to say, what is your name? What do I call you? I'm going to go to these people. I was kind of in their master's court. We're not on best terms. I fled that country. I'm supposed to go back and lead them. You're giving me this mission. Who do I even refer to you as? Oh, just call me I am. What does that mean? So let's parse this out just a little bit, this idea of I am who am. Everyone has these two characteristics, and this is a bit of philosophy. This philosophy comes to us from the Greeks, but it perfectly applies to Christian thought for us. So for all beings, all creatures, we have these two characteristics, these two elements. On one hand, we have our essence, and on the other hand, we have existence. Essence and existence. So essence, let's look at my essence. Essence describes what something is, what something's like, the characteristics of a thing, of a being. So I'll use myself as the first example. What is my essence? What am I? I'm a human. Pretty easy for my essence. I've got brown hair, if everyone can see that. I think it's brown hair. I'm 5'10". Technically, I'm 5'9 3/4", but I'm wearing shoes right now, so we'll call it 5'10". I'm working on my COVID beard. I don't know how it's looking for you guys, but I've been working on that. All of these are just characteristics. You can see that some of them are permanent, some of them are temporary, but this is all a part of my essence. This is who I am. Who I am, that's my essence. Existence. For me, pretty easy. Check mark. Okay, maybe not so easy. For the Greeks and for us, we're going to have to use a term here. We're going to call me a contingent being. I have existence, but my existence is contingent on other things. And on one level, we could look at some of those things. My existence, my continued existence is contingent on me breathing, right? On me staying alive. But more from a philosophical nature, I don't possess my own existence by myself. My existence is kind of predicated on the whole universe existing, on existence itself. I exist in this existence, but existence precedes me, right? So I have existence, I exist, but I'm a contingent being. I'm relying on something else. In a philosophical sense, the cosmos itself existing, existence itself existing allows me to exist, and other things in between. But that's my essence and my existence. Could we imagine for a minute, is there such a being that has essence but no existence? Is there such a being that has essence but no existence? It has characteristics, descriptions of who and how and all things about this type of person, but they don't exist. Think about that for a second. And I think if you've read a really good book lately, you might know some characters that have essence, and maybe very powerful essence, of who they are, what their motivations are, what these characters, we'll call them characters, are like. But they don't actually have existence. On the other hand, let's jump back to God now. I am who am. Let's do this for God. We're going to start with existence. God has existence, but he has it different from you and me. We have contingent existence. What God is saying when he says, I am who am, he's saying that I am the absolute being. He's saying, I am existence itself. All of reality that is contingent on me. Philosophically, this is one of the highest statements that a God could say about himself, right? It's not, oh, I'm the God of the rivers, I control great rivers. Oh, I'm the God of the sun, I control the very mighty sun. No. What our God claims is to be existence itself, on which everything else is predicated. The entire world, you, me, everything and everyone, we have contingent existence. What God is saying is, I am existence itself. From this regard, we could say a lot of different things maybe about God's essence, and maybe not. God's essence can be hard to capture. But for this, God is simply saying, my essence is my existence. That characteristic of being the absolute being is at the core of who I am. I am who am. So beautiful little narrative for us to understand a little bit about who God is with Moses. Anyways, let's continue on with our story. Moses eventually makes it back to Egypt. The people do eventually accept him. He's giving these miracles to convince Pharaoh to meet his demands. And I want to start with what are the first demands of Moses. So these people are enslaved. They're enslaved for years. There's lots of them. Remember, too many. So Pharaoh feels like you have to kill some of them off. And Moses is going to come and make these demands. What does he demand? He says, here's our one demand. Let us go out just a little ways for 3 days and worship our God. Let us go out just a little way for the 3 days and worship our God. And we're going to come right back and we're going to be obedient slaves. All we need is 3 days of PTO. 3 days to go worship our own God. And we'll come right back and be obedient slaves. In hindsight, I think Pharaoh wished that he would have taken his deal. But maybe Pharaoh, like a lot of other tyrants, a lot of other people obsessed with power, couldn't accept this. Couldn't accept even giving that small permission, and he denied that request. You don't get to go even for 3 days. You stay right here. You're all slaves. You don't go anywhere. All right. Well, this isn't Moses' mission. This is God's mission. So what's God going to do? Here's Moses with some of his miracles that he's given to show Pharaoh, but these don't work. Instead, God has to rely on something even more powerful. Enter one of my favorite terms from the scriptures, theomachy. Theo means God and maki means war. Theomachy means the war of the gods. All right, war of the gods. War of the gods. What are we talking about war of the gods for? Well, you see, the first god that the Egyptians are going to put forth is Hapi, the god of the Nile. Think of how important the Nile River is to the Egyptian people, right? If you remember, they lived in a desert, right? There's no fertile land except around the Nile. The Nile is the source of their life, the source of their civilization, the source of their wealth. The Nile is so important to the Egyptians, and this is going to be their first god in the fight, Hapi, the god of the Nile. All right, that's in corner one is Hapi, god of the Nile. Corner two is I am who am. We got Hapi, god of the Nile on one side, and on the other side, I am who am. Really bizarre at this point, because all the Egyptian gods, they get these beautiful statues, they get these beautiful paintings, beautiful imagery. What does I am who am have? We're going to run into this problem later when the people are trying to figure that out. For now, he's going to show up as a cloud in the presence later. Let's just, all right, round one. Oh, I already gave it away. Round one goes to God. What does this really mean? What is the theomachy? The theomachy is the war of the gods. These are the 10 plagues. You see, these aren't just curses that come to Egypt. Rather, these are gods of Egypt. These are representations of their divinities that are being defeated by the God of Israel. The river, the Nile, turns to blood. It's not just a curse. It's the God of Israel coming and saying, you're a God, you're God of the Nile. As important as that God is to you, is nothing. These plagues aren't just curses. It's God showing his divine power to the Egyptians and his own people. There's more gods, all sorts of gods, and we're not sure exactly which one is which for some of these because there's so many gods. But there's a goddess of fertility. There's a beetle god, a fly god, all of these gods representing different thing. This is maybe the curse of the flies and the gnats. There's a bull god, goddess of healing when boils come. All of these plagues, all of these 10 plagues are going to correspond to different gods. And again, every time that we get one of these gods coming up to fight, they get defeated. All these different deities, all these different gods. Again, these plagues aren't just curses. It's the God of Israel showing his superiority. Even to the point of one of the great gods, the sun god himself, right? The sun god himself. Darkness comes. This is 9 plagues so far. 9 plagues so far. And after every plague, it's not enough. These plagues, not just giant curses and terrible things happening, but also God showing his power. But it's not enough for Pharaoh. So there's one more god for the 10th plague. This could be 2 gods. There's a god of life and kind of the god of the afterlife. But also in their culture, Pharaoh himself was considered a god. So the last plague is death of the firstborns. Death of the firstborns meant the death of Pharaoh's son. It means that Pharaoh's going to be, 1, affected personally, but 2, this claim of divine power for Pharaoh is going to be wiped away. So this isn't just the plague that comes immediately. There's something that has to happen first, and this is the Passover. Passover is very interesting, and you need to really pay attention. Take notes on this part of the Passover, because this is going to come back in a really big way in the not too distant future. But the Passover, the people are instructed to go and get a lamb without blemish, right? And they take it and they sacrifice it and they eat it. If you're not a big enough family, you come and share. You have this Passover meal. You're eating certain foods. Your loins are girded. That means that, they wear these tunics and they pull up their tunic and tie it around their thighs so that they're ready to fight and run instead of being twisted up in their tunics. They would eat bread that's unleavened so that they're ready to run. Right? But the key of the meal, the core of the meal, I think, is this Passover lamb that is sacrificed. And in order to enter into this covenant, you eat this lamb that is sacrificed. Now we know there's a book in Scripture, the book of Numbers, which starts with giant amount of census data. We know that not all of the people partook in this Passover feast. In other words, when the angel of death came, the angel of death found some of God's chosen people that did not partake of the Passover feast. They did not eat the lamb. They didn't take and put the blood on the doorpost. If they didn't do what they were supposed to do, they received the same curse. They didn't get passed over. So what did the vegetarians do that night if they weren't hungry for lamb, if they weren't feeling well? If you want the covenant, you ate the lamb. The way to this Passover was to eat the lamb. We're going to come back to that in an episode or 2. But this Passover, we know that most of the people did this, but some of them didn't. Their faith in God was not quite there. Anyways, Passover happens. You can imagine lots of Egyptians dead, and they're not used to this. This isn't part of their existence. They're supposed to be the ruling class, the hierarchy. They're supposed to be at the top. They're not used to this suffering, and this gives the people a chance to escape. At this point, it's no longer going to the desert for 3 days. They're getting out of town, and again, they're ready to go. So they start running. The first thing, it's such a neat story of them escaping. They get to kind of this corner along the river, and a cloud of the presence, the cloud from earlier, comes and protects them, and they can't find a huge mass of people. They just can't be found. Eventually, they come to this great sea, the Red Sea, that they must cross, and it splits wide open, and they pass over on dry ground. Right? What a miracle! They're being pursued. The attackers are coming to kill them. These aren't just attackers, right? These are soldiers, professional soldiers on chariots, on horseback, ready to fight, and they get across over on dry land, and as soon as they're across, all of Pharaoh's men get wiped out. What a great deliverance! Just think about that for a minute. About the God that would protect his people so much, love his people so much, protect them from pursuit, give them this safe and sound passage destroy their attackers, their pursuers. How grateful the people must have been. I bet as soon as they got to the other side, they probably spent days and weeks and months and years in worship and adoration of what a great loving God. Not the story. As soon as they get over, or they're in the desert, journeying to the promised land, and they start to grumble and grumble and grumble and grumble and moan and complain about every single little thing. And you know what they say is that life was so easy under the Egyptian, it's so hard in the desert. This God who brought us out of Egypt, it wasn't worth it. Grumble and grumble and grumble. This is the story for the next 40 years. And every time they grumble, they're asking God for something. God gives them what they want. It's amazing how God keeps giving them what they want every time that they complain. We're thirsty. Okay, here's rain. We're hungry. They can't get their own food. One of the greatest miracles of the Old Testament comes down. This food comes down for them from heaven. This manna from the sky comes down, and every morning the people get to go out and collect this food, this daily bread, this supernatural and super abundant bread that's coming down from heaven for them. They get to collect and eat their daily share, but only their daily share. They can't collect enough for 2 days, so it really is a daily bread because they have to go back daily for it. Kind of this perpetual trust in God, daily trust in God for this daily supernatural, super abundant bread. But they're fed from heaven. Who knows what the manna from the sky was? I've got my own theories of what it tastes like. I'm guessing it's some sort of hummus. I imagine God makes the greatest hummus, but who knows what it was? No clue. Maybe it was something like bread. Who knows? But an absolutely amazing miracle. As the people grumble, they get what they want. Later, they're grumbling, oh, but we want some meat. They get meat. They grumble and they get what they want. God is faithful. God is faithful. God is faithful. Even as the people grumble and complain, God is faithful. And at this point, we get really, I think, to the proper covenant. God talks to the people. He says, "You have seen how I treated the Egyptians and how I bore you up on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me completely and keep my covenant, you will be my treasured possession among all peoples. Though all the earth is mine, you will be to me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation." What a blessing from God, right? What a great blessing that he's going to take this people, he's delivered them, he's gathered them, and he's going to make them a holy people. Something interesting about the Mosaic Covenant. There's actually 3 versions of the Mosaic Covenant. We're on the first one. The first one is a covenant between God and the people. They seal this covenant, by the way, in a very unique way. If you remember back to Abraham walking through the animals cut in half as a sign of their covenant. What they do here is they take their sacrifice and they have buckets of blood. And they literally are dumping buckets of blood up on the altar and buckets of blood over the people. A similar thing with Abraham of this blood, right? This severing of animals, representing that if we break this covenant, let this be done to us. You can imagine maybe the sprinkling rite that we do at the church, but instead it's blood being sprinkled on the people as they're entering this covenant. But again, it's not meant to be gruesome. It's meant to show how serious this covenant was. This absolutely sacred oath that they're entering into. Okay, so they've entered this covenant, and like I said, there's 3 revisions of the Mosaic Covenant. This is the first revision. The first revision is the covenant between God and the people. Blood goes on the altar and on the people. A covenant between God and the people. And something amazing happens. Moses goes up the mountain. This is one of my favorite stories of Scripture. Because Moses says, all right, guys, this is great news. We just entered this great covenant. Now I'm going to go up the mountain, and I get a chance to talk to God face to face. Imagine that for a minute, right? We were using this cloud previously as the depiction of God, a nebulous force. And Moses is telling the people, I get to go up the mountain and talk to God face to face. And he's excited. He's beaming. He's going up the mountain, and he's told the people, and they're waiting for him. Amazing. And the people, what time is it? How long has Moses been up there? What's it been, like 48 hours already? I thought he was coming back. And Aaron has to come to him. Aaron's the right-hand man of Moses and says, all right, calm down. Do you remember that Moses is going up the mountain to speak to God face to face? He said he'll be back in 2 weeks. 2 weeks. It's been 2 days. Calm down. He's talking to God face to face. He'll be right back. And then people say, all right. Some more time goes on and they say, he's been up there a while. You know, it's been 4 days now. And Aaron says, all right, calm down. Moses is up the mountain. He's talking to God face to face. He said to wait here and he'll be right back. And the people get more and more antsy. And eventually they give up on Moses. And they tell Aaron, this is taking way too long. We've got a plan of our own. What we're going to do is collect the gold, jewelry, and things that we have. And we get to this famous incident of the golden calf. We're going to make our own God. We can't be sitting around here waiting for Moses to show up again. We're going to make our own God, and we're going to fashion it just like we knew in Egypt. It's going to be basically an Egyptian God. And you know what? This is the God that took us out of Egypt. This is the God that we're going to worship. Just imagine everything that's happened in the story until now, and the people just abandon God like that. It's at that moment, it seems. Oh, and by the way, what a beautiful image of the people. They look so pious worshiping this golden calf. That's not what was happening. This is not what happened in Scripture. It was much more of a party. There's a lot more debauchery going on. They weren't piously worshiping a golden calf. They were having a party. They were celebrating. And celebrating in ways that no one should celebrate at a big party. They were doing things that are immoral and illicit, and they knew it. And this is the moment that Moses arrives. And what has he got in his hands? He's got these 2 tablets. Remember, I told you 3 revisions of the Mosaic covenant. This is the first one. And the stone tablets that he's carrying, Scripture says that they are written with the finger of God. He's carrying these tablets that were literally written on by God himself to give the people instruction. And he gets to the mountain, he's probably beaming and smiling and excited to get back. And what does he find? Debauchery, idolatry, adultery, every sin that you could think of going on with this golden calf. He's not happy. He's not happy. And despite this covenant being entered into, we see that there's the 2 further revisions of the covenant have to come into play. The second revision, it said, is made between God and Moses and the people. Kind of like God, Moses, people. The third revision is made between God and Moses. The people go from kind of being the first-hand members of the covenant to being second-hand, being attached to Moses. And now they're kind of left off. The covenant's really with Moses. The tablets get destroyed. The first pair of tablets gets destroyed, and they have to be remade. Remember, the first pair of tablets were written by the finger of God. Second pair of tablets, Moses has to inscribe. The people fall into idolatry so easily. They fall into sin so easily. Even with this great, wonderful God doing all of these things, it's hard for them to remain faithful. With that, I want to talk for just a second about the law. The law. And maybe this is going to give us a little bit of insight into some of the things that Christ is going to say about the law. Because he says some very odd things about the law, right? He says seemingly conflicting things about the law. He's here to fulfill it, or are you not justified by works of the law? Are you going to fulfill it, or do we not need them anymore? Which is it? And this is a subject that I think a lot of scholars have studied. One of my favorites is St. Thomas Aquinas. What St. Thomas Aquinas does is he divides the law into 6 different categories. And there's categories. One of them, for example, is basically the laws for worship, for liturgy. They have a certain way that they need to worship. But there's laws, there's human laws, right? How to have a human civilization. There's all sorts of laws. There's moral laws also. And what Aquinas does is he has these 6 different categories of laws. And he goes through pretty much every law in the Old Testament. And he tells why it was appropriate and good for God to give that law to that people at that time. I'm going to give you 2 main reasons that Aquinas gives why those laws are important, or one principle and maybe the main reason. The first principle is called normative inversion. Normative inversion. Basically, everything that the Egyptians did, the people had to do opposite. If the Egyptians did it, you don't, and if the Egyptians didn't do it, you do it. God was giving these laws to protect the culture of this people that had been in slavery, the Egyptians, for so long, they didn't have their own cultural identity. God wanted them to remember who they were, that they were his chosen people, and they had to build that really from the ground up at this point. So normative inversion is an inversion of the norms of Egypt. They got the opposite, right? But the number one reason that Aquinas has for all the different laws is to avoid idolatry. Avoid idolatry. Avoid idolatry, avoid idolatry, avoid idolatry. Almost half the laws seem to be to avoid idolatry. Why? Because God knows how quick the people can fall into idolatry. At a flip of a hat, they can start worshiping other gods. They can abandon God, the real God, and walk away and do something else. God is trying to avoid that. I think the lesson for us, again, Aquinas gives a lesson for us in all these laws also, is that our spiritual life is more important than even our human life. Avoiding idolatry is so important and so critical that sometimes there's even things that maintain that spiritual life, preserve that spiritual life at the sake of human life. And maybe we'll talk some more about some of those things when we get to David. But spiritual life, absolutely more important than our life, than our human physical life. The spiritual life comes first, always, always, always. So we have to avoid idolatry. I want to jump back to those 6 categories of law real quick. There's 6 categories. One of them is called the moral law, the 10 Commandments that we have here. The 10 Commandments are not teachings for a particular people at a particular place and time. They are laws that are based on absolute truths, right? So the law of you shall not murder. That is based on the fact that people are made in the image and likeness of God. They have human dignity, and as such, it's immoral, it's wrong, it's opposed to the law to murder someone. That's not a particular teaching for particular people at a particular time. That is based on universal truth. And all the moral law fits into this, right? They are based on universal truth. You shall have one God. Don't lie. Don't commit adultery. These are universal truths, not tied to culture, place, or time. For that reason, as Catholics, as Christians today, we are still bound by the moral law. They're universal, they're absolute. We still can't murder, we still can't commit adultery, we can't do any of those things still because it's absolute truth that put those laws in motion. On the other hand, every other category of law, the laws about worship and liturgy, the Jewish liturgy, and the laws about how to make sacrifices, right? We have a new sacrifice, but all those laws about sacrifices, those laws about how to act as a human culture, all of those go away in the new covenant with Christ. Moral law remains, but those other categories of law will go away. And I think we're going to get back to this concept in a little bit in a future session when we get to Christ. But that's a quick overview of some of the law. That moral law remains foundational for all our moral life, but the other categories of law are going to go away. All right, so a bit to kind of tie up this story of Moses. They're in the desert for years and years and years. They eventually make it to the promised land. God fulfills his promise, but this generation doesn't get in. They have to wait for the next generation to get in, and that's going to take us right into the story of King David. But a few takeaways from the story of Moses and the people in Exodus. First, we can see that God's chosen people has greatly expanded. We've gone from one individual, Adam, to a couple, Adam and Eve. We increased that to a family with Noah, up to a tribe with Abraham, and now we're a proper nation. 12 tribes with thousands of people total. So a proper nation is being gathered now. Gathered together by God, a loving Father who wants to gather them together, preserve them, protect them, take them to where they need to go, and fulfill his promises to them. God's continuing that action, and he's going to continue still. God, I think this whole section of Scripture just emphasizes so strongly God's unwavering faithfulness to his people. They grumble and moan and complain, commit idolatry over and over, do all sorts of terrible, nasty things, and God is still their loving, providential Father who loves them. Absolutely amazing to show us God's love for us. I think the story of the prodigal son shows that, but the whole 40 years in the desert is basically that story, right? They're turning away, but God is always there for them, always fulfilling his promises, even when the people aren't fulfilling theirs. There's also a strong lesson of following God's plan. God's plan often seems a little bit scary, a little bit daunting. The idea of huddling up against the great sea and hiding there and hoping that they don't get caught, they had to trust in God. Even the idea of Passover, what a crazy idea. They had to trust in God. Trusting even in Moses, that Moses had this message to get them free. They had to trust in God. Wandering through the desert, receiving the manna from the sky and trusting it would be there the next day. They had to trust in God. They had to trust in God. Even when God's plan doesn't seem to make sense, it's just a story of always, always, always trusting God's plan for us. Obviously parallels to our own spiritual life. Always trust in God. We need to discern his will. We need to make sure that we know it, but we need to trust God's plan more than our own. Maybe that's especially relevant now with COVID-19 still being an issue, right? We can be stuck in quarantine and going crazy, but be patient, trust in God's plan. Great time to grow in your prayer life, right? Stuck at home, great time to pray a little bit more. But always, always, always trust in God's plan. I think the final point to make about the story is we have so much foreshadowing here. We have set up so much for future covenants and eventually the coming of Christ. Some of the greatest miracles of the Old Testament are happening, and we're really just setting the groundwork to reveal that when Christ comes, he is the fulfillment, the absolute fulfillment of all of the great promises that have been given to the people in the past. They had a Passover to deliver them from slavery. They're going to have a new Passover to deliver them not from slavery of Egyptians, but slavery of sin, and open wide the gates of heaven. They had manna from the sky, a food that they could receive daily. We're going to get a gift like that also, but much, much better than what they had with Moses. Anyways, that's a few thoughts on the covenant with Moses. Really neat story. I hope that you guys enjoyed it. Next is, I think, my absolute favorite character in Scripture. This is King David playing his harp. It's so hard to get a picture of King David. Half the images of David are him conquering Goliath. Great story, but there's so much more than just that. I'd really recommend that if you can, keep reading along with us. Read the story of David, at least 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. Really amazing, great, compelling stories. Again, still in the narrative books, still just very compelling stories. So read Scripture, and until then, we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.